Rainy days and snow days, one of the best TT fortnights in living memory. The warmest June on record, followed by the wettest July on record. We've certainly seen all kinds of weather during the last 12 months here on the Isle of Man. Fast am I, and good evening and welcome to a special programme here on Manx Radio, where for the next half hour, myself, Ben Hartley, and Senior Met Officer at Ronaldsway Kirsty Pendlebury will look back at some of the biggest weather events of 2023. So let's start with the weather that gets many people very excited or indeed filled with dread, depending on your preference, and that is snow.
Oh, the weather outside is frightful.
The two main sort of events that we had were kind of created through different weather phenomena, really. In January, it was kind of caused by wintry showers, and we're quite renowned on the island for getting showers that through the winter are triggered by the sea temperatures, so that makes us a lot more susceptible to seeing showers than sort of the larger land masses. And they, in a northwesterly direction, come down through the North Channel and line themselves up with the island and continually cross us and head off towards sort of, Cheshire and the Wirral and into England. And within that, we saw obviously quite a lot of wintry showers, but it made it quite unusual in that the exact wind direction meant the showers were all lined up across the centre of the island, whereas the far north and the far south of the island didn't really see very much. So there were people like, in Port Erin or Ramsey going, what snow, and the central part kind of just kept getting showers continuously. I think we started with a yellow warning and then had to actually escalate it to an amber because we could see the amount of snow that was sort of mounting up, particularly over the central parts of the island.
And one thing that always sort of fascinates me is in Peel, if I'm sort of leaving Peel to drive through to work here in Douglas, I've seen this a few times, nothing in Peel, or very little anyway. You get past QE2, get that bit further inland, and suddenly it just turns white. It sort of appears out of nowhere. Is that to do with wind direction and the sea, I'm assuming?
Yeah, a lot of it will be to do with wind direction. Like I said, if you had the wind direction ever so slightly more northerly, it would be the south of the island that's more affected. If it had a slightly more westerly or west-northwesterly direction to it, it would be more the north of the island. So it's to do with that as well. But obviously, as the air sort of comes in on shore as well, the sea will have helped to keep the temperature a little bit warmer, whereas on the opposite side of the island, on the east side of the island, in a northwesterly, that's likely to be colder, so you're going to see more chance of snow there as well.
So in effect then, if the wind is blowing westerly and coming in to Peel, the sea is warming it up, and it takes a little bit of travelling time effectively to get inland to cool down temperatures enough for the snow to actually fall as snow rather than rain, is that?
Yeah, basically the land temperature is a little bit cooler than the sea is, and that's what helps to cool the air mass above it, and that's what will help it to fall ultimately as snow more on the opposite side of the island, on the lee side.
You describe it so much better. That was a very basic description from me there, but in essence we absolutely understand what you mean. Yeah, a big old snowfall 17th of January. Comparatively it seemed to be sort of a sort of middle ground snowfall, not sort of huge, but there was a decent covering in certain parts of the island.
Yeah, like certainly the middle part of the island really saw issues with being able to travel around and things as well. And I think sometimes the problem that people have with that as well is if you're going from the north or the south, say to Douglas to go to work, you leave home and you think everything's fine, and then suddenly you realise en route things are deteriorating, because it's hard to understand how much snow may have fallen once you get to sort of Douglas area as well.
Now the March snowfall, 9th, 10th of March, this was sort of over 2 days. This was memorable in the respect that everybody was waiting for the snow to arrive, and particularly challenging for you because on that Thursday, the 9th, schools were closed in anticipation of the snow arriving, but generally it didn't come until the evening time. So that must be very, very difficult, again, with the island and the geography and the different heights to predict exactly when that rain will be cold enough to turn to snow.
Yeah, it's a really awkward one that. Ultimately, we had a weather system coming in. As the weather system came in, the cold air was starting to dig in as well, and that was what was going to bring the sort of general freezing level down, which was going to turn it increasingly to snow. But the other thing that helps to contribute as to when it will turn to snow is if you've got sort of moderate or heavy rainfall falling for a prolonged period of time, that will help to bring the freezing level down a lot quicker as well. But actually trying to get the timing right of exactly when that level gets to where you're going to get snow at low levels especially It's really difficult to forecast. It's very dependent on the intensity of the rain as well. It certainly looked from the day before like we were going to see it coming in middle of the afternoon, really. And, we were seeing snow falling in place, and over higher ground it was starting to stick. There's been previous times where, snow can come in a little bit earlier, and then it's problematic trying to get children home from school. We didn't really want to run that risk of it, so they took an early decision to close the schools that day. Unfortunately, majority of the island actually managed to sort of stay clear of the worst of the snow until around about, I think, say 6 or 7 that evening. It really started to stick, and then overnight we obviously had quite a lot, and it was fairly widespread, so by the time you woke up the following morning it was definitely white.
Yeah, most of the island had a covering in the March snowfall. I mean, how much pressure is there on you and the team at the Met Office, particularly when it comes to the schools being open or shut? A lot of people watch very closely because of their own personal arrangements and how it will affect their lives, that snowfall. When people are watching really closely, is there a lot of pressure? Does it add more pressure to the job?
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, ultimately our role at the end of the day is that we want to try and get the warnings out and make sure people are aware of any severe situations so that they don't get caught out and don't end up in difficulty somewhere. It's always difficult with snow, and the fact that we're surrounded by the sea does have that impact of reducing maybe the amount of snow we see, how low down we'll get it, and how the amounts with it as well. And so it does add a lot of extra pressure onto the team. We, at the end of the day, we don't want to tell people that something's going to happen and then it not happen. Basically, we try to give you the best information that we can at the time based on the current weather data. But obviously, there are always situations where the computer models don't handle the weather situation very well. And we're always going to get maybe caught out. And, years ago, you could have got away with saying there's going to be snow on Wednesday. Now you need to be able to say exactly what time it's going to happen at.
I was going to say, the advent of technology, and you've got some amazing equipment now at Ronaldsway. Again, that must have added a pressure in the respect that people expect you to be that much more accurate and precise now with timings and so forth.
I mean, whether the snow started to stick at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock made a massive difference. Could the buses get home before it started to stick or not? And that's where there's always a level of uncertainty with that of an hour or so, really, even when we try our best.
On a day like that, do you sort of look out of the window almost willing the snow to come at the time you predicted?
Oh yeah, definitely. At the end of the day, you always want the forecast to try and go as well as possible, because you don't want to have put people out when they've not needed to be put out, having to find people to look after children if they had to work and things like that. No one takes those decisions easily, but at the end of the day, it's based on what's the safest for everybody, basically.
And when it comes to the big weather events, you and the team at the Met Office liaise with a large number of people if we're expecting snow or really strong winds. I think you talk to the police, civil defence, government representatives. You have these sort of teams meetings, don't you, to sort of nail down exactly what weather we're expecting and how the island will then deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, the first people that we really speak to sort of on a daily basis really through the winter, because there's usually something for them to be concerned about, is sort of the DOI and highways people, because at the end of the day, whether it's that trees may get blown down, that drains may get blocked from heavy rain, that the gritters need to go out, they're usually the first lot of people to respond. But yeah, especially once we get to sort of an amber level warning, that does sort of trigger a tactical group meeting, and that does incorporate the emergency services, all of them, myself and members of the team from the Met Office, the emergency planning officer as well. And it basically just tries to get the communication out to the public of what to expect, preempt anything that we think is going to become an issue, and have a contingency in place to try and reduce the amount of disruption that the public will see.
Let it snow.
This is Manx Radio, and you're listening to a look back at some of the more interesting weather we've experienced over the last 12 months. We'll hear more from Kirsty a little later in the programme, when we'll turn our attention to some of the hotter temperatures we experienced this year. And it was in the summer, just before TT 2023, that I took a trip to the Ronaldsway Met Office to look ahead to TT Fortnight and find out exactly what life is like there during one of the busiest periods on the island. I caught up with Adrian Cowan, who's now enjoying a well-earned retirement, and first of all, forecaster Neil Young.
The start of the day probably starts before many people are up and about. The clerk of the course generally is on the phone about 6 o'clock in the morning, and things really start to ramp up probably 7 o'clock onwards, where actually that's when we're giving advice for clerk of the course, for the emergency services, because that's when the decisions are going to be made about closing the roads. Is it going to happen today? What's going to happen? If it's a fine day and it's all going right, well, actually, that's good, because if it's a fine day, that's pretty much us. But it's if it's bad weather. If then there's a delay, if the clerk of the course decides that either something's happened with dampness on the road, which the rain may well have cleared 3 hours ago, but it's still wet at Glen Helen. But actually, you've got to get finished by 5 o'clock because this is going to happen then. And then it's just constant all day. And you're constantly on a knife edge.
And the clerk of the course, AD, obviously somebody that you're in constant communication with, but there's all the other agencies, like Neil was mentioning there, the emergency services. There's an awful lot of people, as well as just the general public and the race fans, who really do need to know, as you mentioned earlier, for safety reasons as well, just how that weather is playing out.
Well, absolutely. There's lots of factors that go into decision making behind the scenes. Weather is a factor, but there are other possible influences that the clerk of the course has to take into consideration in association with consultations with the emergency services. There may be other matters that we don't know about, but he knows about, and we're thinking, why haven't they gone with our advice? And it transpires later on that he had an issue perhaps of, for example, positioning and numbers of marshals, road conditions. There's been a late spillage of diesel or fuel oil. Or one year, I remember there was some issues with, there was a spillage of grain. Grain transporter had toppled over and left the road covered. But it's all about communication. We stay on top of our job. We communicate with the clerk of the course and anybody else who needs to know that information. He communicates with all the people he needs to communicate with, including the marshals, the police, Manx Radio, for example, a great way of communicating the big messages. And I think the Isle of Man puts that together great every year, working together to make the event happen and make it happen as safely as possible.
Do you feel that pressure more when there are those other factors, when those windows are tighter because of whatever might be going on, whatever reason, roads have had to stay shut or whatever? If there are tighter windows, does it get more difficult for you or more pressurised?
It certainly does, and it gives you a new nervous twitch as you look over the horizon at the satellite pictures or the radar pictures, and you're thinking, those showers that we thought were going to be knocking on the door for 6 o'clock this evening, they're now going to be at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and we're there going, oh, twitch, 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 ring the clerk of the course.
I was going to say, if there's a sudden change, if the modelling suddenly changes, do you get straight on the phone and let the clerk of the course and the organisers know?
Oh, absolutely, because the sooner he knows that there's something now on the horizon that was either unexpected or it's coming sooner than previously expected, let them know, because it's one of those factors, again, that can help them as an organising committee and the clerk of the course make an adjustment. And if it so happens to keep the event safe and yet complete it, if a race has to be shortened by 1 or 2 laps just to complete it safely, then we let them know.
And how quickly can it change in that respect?
It can change really quickly in the Irish Sea, especially at this time of the year when you can get a change of airflow or temperatures, daytime temperatures lift some shower clouds that you didn't previously expect, and that can happen. And those days are really difficult because those shower clouds, sometimes they're not showers that you've imported from elsewhere, they are locally developed showers. And by that I mean the land on the Isle of Man warms up in response to sunshine, and all of a sudden you spot there's now a risk of a heavy shower breaking out over the middle of the course. And indeed, over the years, TT commentators have spotted that and commented on that via Manx Radio and Radio TT that I don't believe it. 10 minutes ago the sun was shining and now it's pouring down. I also remember Jeff Cannell one year, and I seem to remember it was at Ballacrane, and Jeff said, oh, it's a glorious day for racing, and it's gone round. Everyone's happy. And the next moment is Jeff there going, I don't believe it. There's hailstones at Ballacrane. There's hailstones. What's happening? And it was a locally developed shower. It was a heavy shower, heavy downpour, just in that area during a race.
And whilst I was talking to Adi and Neil, I had to ask about those dreaded words that anyone involved in the TT does not want to hear. And those words are fog on the mountain.
That is the one that is a showstopper, and it's the most difficult one to forecast for, really. The height of the cloud level and the arrival of mist on the mountain or fog even lower down. And we've seen all of those variations because of the shape of the Isle of Man. The topography of the Isle of Man lends itself to either hill fog or coastal mist, or both on the same day. And not necessarily just on one part of the course. Sometimes it's restricted to just one part of the course, but there are other days where it moves around. One of the good things that has helped us is colleagues in the DOI thankfully installed some decent webcams up on the mountain road, and that helps us confirm we can visually see what is it like now. We've always been able to have measurements up there, but you can't beat a good quality webcam picture.
We talk about fog, but Neil, rain obviously plays a big part in this. Just sort of thinking back over your 35 odd years you've been here, are there any TT fortnights that really stand out as being a sort of complete washout?
We've had some very, very wet spells, certainly one in the early 90s, where I think we got rain virtually every day, and we got heavy rain, we got flooding. We had people in tents, just had to move. People opened up their homes, they opened up parish halls, people sleeping on the floor of the sea terminal. The Isle of Man, as it always does, really pulled out all the stops and looked after people.
Adrian Cowan and Neil Young talking to me just prior to this year's TT Fortnight. So let's hear once again from Kirsty Pendlebury, now Senior Met Officer at Ronaldsway, about what was one of the best TT fortnights for weather many people can remember.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, ultimately, throughout the entire TT fortnight, there was basically no measurable rainfall at all, which was just amazing. And we only really, I think, had one day where the weather kind of impacted the racing, and that was just where we had a little bit of low cloud and mist that took a while to sort of lift as the day went on, which I think gave everyone a bit of a shock, really. After such nice weather, I mean, and on the whole, June ended up being the warmest June on record for the Isle of Man, and the hottest day was the 13th, so just towards the sort of the end of the TT period, with a 28.1 degrees Celsius. So really quite gorgeous weather really for TT this year.
It was incredible, wasn't it? And that day when we had that mist on the mountain, I was speaking to some visitors who were first timers to the island, and up until then, the few days beforehand, glorious weather. They were like, hang on, what's all this? We're not used to this. I said, this is what it's normally like. You're seeing the kind of the real side of TT, because it is, I think, unusual, isn't it, to get such a good period of weather throughout the end of May, beginning of June, through that TT fortnight.
Yeah, definitely. Like I just said, warmest June on record, but also, we've had records going back at Ronaldsway since 1947, and throughout June we actually had sort of 269 hours of bright sunshine burn onto the cards at the airfield, and that's 62 hours more than what the long-term average is. So that's an awful lot more sunshine that we don't usually get. So yeah, it felt particularly, I think, pleasant during June, which is just as well because it didn't carry on.
No, this is it, isn't it? And that's what's interesting. June was so good. We thought, this is it. We're in for a great summer. But actually, July turned out to be, a bit of a wet one.
Yeah, it was the wettest July on record, and the second windiest as well. One of the wettest days actually was the 23rd of July, and that was when the Grand Fondo was on as well. So 35 millimetres of rain fell that day.
We imagine for you that the summer is perhaps an easier time because the weather is clearly more settled than it is in the winter. But actually, so many outdoor events in the summer, and we do get some terrible days throughout June, July and August. So again, you must have to really keep an eye on things there in terms of the events and people wanting it, like with snow days, as we mentioned earlier. Equally, big outdoor event in the summer, if it's going to be lashing down or really windy, people really want to know that detail.
Yeah, I think when we're forecasting for the summer, if you're looking at more sort of severe weather and it's at an unusual time of year, it will impact whether or not, whether we choose to put a warning out, whether it's perhaps just below warningable level, but because of the time of year and the unusual experience to have it at that time, it makes you want to put the warning out to give people a heads up for it. For example, in August, we had the named storm, which was Betty, and that was on the 18th of August. But that obviously was quite out of character to be having a named storm in August. You know, you would usually think that the weather would be a bit calmer then. So that helps to make you think, oh, do you know what? Because it's that time of year, people have got their garden furniture out. They're having their nice sort of summer stuff in the garden and things, and out doing nice summery things. Stuff's more likely to get blown around when you're not used to ready for really strong winds, really.
Was there any reason why we had such a good June and such a bad July, or was it just one of those weird weather things?
It's just the way that the positioning of the jet stream, you know, like that's so hard to sort of like forecast and predict long term. But ultimately, if we end up with the jet stream pulling the low pressure system straight across the Atlantic and throwing them straight at the UK, then that's where we get those really unsettled spells, which is what we got in July when it was really wet. And in June, we were just lucky enough that the jet stream had moved further enough that we ended up with this big area of high pressure dominating the weather across the British Isles. I wouldn't say that the seasons are as typical as perhaps they used to be as well. You know, with climate change and things, you do start to see more severe events happening at different times. So the jet stream really does impact sort of whether we get storms brought straight to us from across the Atlantic or whether we end up, you know, with slightly calmer conditions.
You've been at the Ronaldsway Met Office now for, let's see, over 10 years, isn't it? And obviously you were working at the UK Met Office in Exeter for a few years before that. In your time working in weather, have you seen a great change in the patterns, and as you alluded to there, the sort of the seasons maybe not being so defined as they once were?
Yeah, I feel like there's no, you know, I mean, a lot of people always think that once you get towards sort of Christmas, you should be getting the cold, wintry sort of conditions. But actually, it's usually more towards like after the new year, once we start into the sort of the beginning of the new year. But I would say that recently, you know, we start to see stuff still going on even in like April. You could still get in March and April getting snow events and things as well. So, and that's the start of spring. So it doesn't necessarily feel like it necessarily completely fits. And like I said about the storm happening in August, just your summer, you just find sometimes that it's not quite in the traditional months, seasons that we used to sort of get.
So June and July, great contrast. Get to September, the first week or so of September was absolutely glorious for the time of year.
Yeah, it was a bit of a late burst of summer, really, wasn't it? I mean, we hadn't had very much sort of nice, dry, warm weather since sort of June. And then we ended up with several days where we saw temperatures up into the 20s. It was also the warmest September on record for Ronaldsway. The peak was sort of 24.5 degrees, and that was on the 5th of September. But it was also quite wet as well. We had sort of 40% more rain, and we had 2 days of gales as well. So it was one of those months which is quite typical for September, a transition month where it goes from sort of maybe the calmer, sunnier summer conditions into the sort of more autumnal conditions. And we definitely saw that probably more so this year than we have perhaps in other years, where we went from such dry and warm weather to sort of like we had another named storm. We had Agnes on the 27th to end the month.
Yeah, this is it. And that's the next thing I was going to ask, actually, about the number of storms we've had so far this season. The storm season runs from September. Is that when it begins each year? Is that the sort of meteorological year?
Yeah, so it sort of starts in the autumn winter for August this year. That we had our second named storm, which was Betty, which was actually from last year's.
Yeah, it took nearly a year to get through just 2 storms.
Yeah. And we're already on about the 5th or 6th now. So it's you know, they come around quite quickly this year. Obviously, one of the most memorable ones, I think, probably just recently was sort of in November. We had Storm Debbie, caused quite a lot of sort of disruption, really. I think there was about 50 trees down across the island. And obviously, that really impacts people travelling.
At what point does bad weather become a storm? What does it have to sort of reach for you to actually, or the Met Office across, or an island, or wherever, so say, right, actually, this will be the next storm?
So the criteria is sort of really for the UK Met Office and Met Air, and I think it's parts of North West Europe as well. They're all split into different sections, and that's when they'll adopt storm names.
Is it where it reaches landfall? Is that what it is?
Yeah, it is. And it's also usually in terms of sort of the UK and Met Air sides, which are the ones that we see as named storms. Traditionally, it's once you see an amber warning going out. So it has to be somewhere within basically the UK is going to receive an amber warning. But sometimes the problem with that is that the storm becomes named, but obviously not everywhere in the UK is going to be impacted in the same way. So, for example, like Jersey and Guernsey with the storm that kind of caught them, they obviously had really severe winds, but actually to the north and where we were, it was a bit more of a non-event, really. So it's kind of, although the naming of storms is really helpful, equally it can kind of like cause a bit of an issue when it comes to trying to get the information across in the press, because people will think, oh, because it's a named storm, it's going to be really bad, and not everywhere is going to see something that's really severe. It might just feel like a windy day on the Isle of Man.
So without a doubt then, 2023 has provided all sorts of different weather, keeping you and all the team there well and truly on your toes. It's worth noting, the Met Office at Ronaldsway, a 24/7, 365 operation. You know, you and the team down there, it's manned constantly, and it's crucial that that is the case.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the weather doesn't stop, not even for Christmas. And obviously you can't say that you're not going to get a storm arrive on Christmas Day. In fact, I do remember years ago we've had sort of really some quite stormy weather either on Christmas Eve, and once was on Boxing Day as well. So if you've got a storm or something arriving Boxing Day, Christmas Day can be quite a busy shift, you know, making sure the warnings and everything are issued for the following day. So it's certainly doesn't mean that we get a quiet time of year just because everyone's at home having their turkey.
And of course you've stepped up now to the senior position at the Met Office. I mean, you've always loved what you do. You're still enjoying it down there, but a bit different now, I imagine.
Yeah, not so much of the forecasting side anymore. I'm doing a lot more of sort of other stuff in the background. But, it's just an absolute honour and a privilege, really, to sort of be part of the Met Office team. The guys down there are working so hard all the time, and I'm just really proud of them for everything that they do, you know, and it's my dream job. It's the one I always worked for.
And our thanks to Kirsty Pendlebury from Ronaldsway Met Office for joining us on this special programme looking back at some of the biggest weather events throughout 2023. And of course, here on Manx Radio, with the help of the Met Office, we'll keep you right up to date with the very latest weather as we go throughout the rest of the Christmas and New Year period and into 2024. This programme will shortly be available as an extended podcast at manxradio.com.